This is the Broadleaf from Harris CKC Knives. I've decided to start to do a series of videos where I'm going to use some larger outdoor chopping type blades together in parallel and explore the differences in design and how they translate to various aspects of use. This isn't going to be a versus style video where I'm sort of saying which one is better or which one to choose. It's more or less what they bring out in each other and sort of what I can learn and glean from using the two blades, usually of differences in design on similar tasks, again to try to understand the little nuances in performance and sort of explore where I would want to use one over the other one. So for the first comparison, I was using the Broadleaf alongside the Excalibur from Mike Gavick, which possibly may be one of his signature pieces. And it's one of my favorite large knives for a number of reasons. Enclosed tang, two-handed grip, multi-position for single hand, very nice blade shape, decent steel for outdoor work. This is 01. I'd prefer something like S7 ideally, but 01's pretty decent, much better than a lot of the choices available. So I started off doing some work on a sawhorse, cutting up a lot of scrap wood, some reclaimed lumber, and some freshly felled wood. And I was doing a decent volume of wood, so I got the ability to explore even small issues, come out rather strongly. With the Broadleaf, there was a few, again, minor issues with the handle. Working in a close-up grip, trying to neutralize the balance and reduce the blade length to increase precision, I found this could be rounded a bit more in the transition. The Excalibur is very good in an overhand grip, no issues with comfort. I found that this hump right here was a bit too sharp. Similarly on the Excalibur it was a bit too sharp. I found that the grip was a bit too slick for me. I'd want it to be a bit more texture. Same thing with the Excalibur. Grips are very personally sensitive because they depend on how you're using, how you're swinging, and the nature of your hand itself. Lastly, I found that the tang on this, because it's full tang, full width, made the top of the knife a bit too flattish. I want it to be more heavily contoured, and a taper tang would allow that there because it would slim this out and allow it to be more round in the transition. And again, literally after like 1,000 pieces of wood chopped, I could feel the sort of effect of that flattish type grip. But overall, very strong, as it is functional in your three main grips, but again, I could bring it that little step up with a few modifications that I'll probably do. Very similar with Mike's grip on the Excalibur. In terms of raw power and penetration, I found the Excalibur was around 10 to 20% better. It's very difficult to get very precise numbers in wood chopping because there's so much variance in wood. Even if you take a stock piece of 2x4 and you do like 10 cuts on it, you're not going to get into the single digits in terms of precision because there's so much variance in the wood, even in the grain and knots and stuff like that. But just looking at when the Excalibur ran perfect and the Broadleaf ran perfect, and just over in general type of feel that I was getting, around 10 to 20% more penetration with the Excalibur. Now, that was a bit surprising at first because it is quite a bit longer, especially when you go with a more rare grip and it's slightly heavier. But the problem was that because I was holding onto the wood with my offhand, I really couldn't get the large body movement that you need to bring the full power behind the weight and length of this. So it tended out to me that the Broadleaf sort of hit a sweet spot that when I was working with that restricted type body movement, it was a very nice combination of mass and balance and length that sort of hit that sweet spot for me. But that's going to be very personally dependent, and if you don't hold on to wood with your offhand, the Excalibur will come significantly then beyond 10 to 20% higher. But a lot of the work that I do, even forgetting the sawhorse and just having fun breaking up reclaimed lumber, when I'm out working, taking down deadfall and even cutting poles and limbing them out, I'm holding the wood with my offhand a lot of the times. So it limits, again, the gross body movements that I can do. And this actually ends up to me to be the perfect sweet spot, because when I go back like this, the blade then has sort of an effective overall length of around 14 inches, and that's the sweet spot that I find. Going beyond 14 inches makes it a bit too focused. For me, it turns it more into a machete than a longer knife. And going a little less than 14 inches generally isn't that optimal, and you're just reducing length and power. So this hits a sort of sweet spot for me for that type of work. Now, this is a bit more fluid than the Excalibur because it has sort of a thicker wedge shape. Basically, it's similar blade stock. Both of them are relatively heavy, but this is a bit more narrow, so it has a more wedge shape, which means it's a bit freer in some of the woods. But that more narrow taper basically means on your harder woods, especially the woods that are a bit springy, this does fall behind the Excalibur. And you can see in sometimes when I'm trying to cut harder woods, it's clear that this isn't getting the type of penetration that the Excalibur is, which has sort of, again, your finer taper. So as the wood sort of got softer and more stickier to cut, this became the knife that I would prefer. As the wood got harder, and definitely as it got springier, I tended to want to use the Excalibur. And there's a bit more into the curvature of the blades too, which relates to that, which I'll get to in a second. Both blades have very thick blade stock, so they're extremely rigid. So prying with the main bodies of the blade with each one of them didn't make any difference. They're both, like I said, very rigid and very strong. However, the Excalibur has a very thin point. Now, that very thin point is very nice, again, for cutting finer vegetation, because when you're working with the last, say, inch and a half of the blade, it's very thin, so it easily sails through and makes complete cuts. But you don't want to be finer prying with this. I'd snap that off easily if I stabbed it into a piece of wood. Crack. The tip would come right off. Again, it's not made to do that. But the broadleaf has a very chunky tip, and you can see it has this very extreme wedge taper. So not made for finer cutting. But on the reclaimed lumber, you can see oftentimes it was full of nails. I was prying a lot of that apart and just hitting it with the back of the knife and using this sort of as an inverted spike, easily prying that apart, jamming this tip in the wood, leveraging apart, no issues, no concern. So I got that pry bar sort of chisel digging type implement, and working with sods and stuff as well, very durable tip. So a lot of utility there, where I would want the broadleaf over the Excalibur, and again where I'd want the Excalibur over the broadleaf when I was doing lighter vegetation cutting and wanted to be able to sweep the tip through the material. The tip on the broadleaf also had another interesting application where it pulled ahead of the Excalibur. When I was chopping relatively close to the ground, I could cut right here with the Excalibur right close to the ground, and you can see how the tip sweeps up very fast out of the way. So when this area of the blade was cutting relatively close to the ground, this section of the tip was protected and didn't make contact with the ground, protected it. When I switched initially to using the Excalibur, making the same cuts, you'll see the first few cuts that I was making down close to the ground, I didn't get through them right away. And what I realized was, because I was cutting actually in the bevel region, and I was getting full cut depth here, but because this swept up out of the way, I wasn't getting cut all the way through to the tip. So in order to rectify that, I had to tilt the knife forward a little bit, so I sort of cut like this rather than cutting like that. So you'll see, after I sort of figured that out, I was able to cut through the wood close to the ground relatively easy. But again, I would prefer to work with the broadleaf down there. The tip is a bit too fine on this. I really wouldn't want to work in that sort of close proximity to the ground with this. And if you look at the ground, you can see a lot of it is moss covered over with large rocks. And I wouldn't sort of want to bang, do a hard chop and smash this into rocks. There's not very much metal up here by the tip, and you could end up breaking a piece of it off. And the curvature again means I had to sort of tilt forward at a bit too much of an awkward angle. So for felling and cutting the wood down, prying the wood apart, and just doing heavier work, that especially comes in use in the winter time when you're working on frozen wood and you're trying to pry it apart. Broadleaf is much preferred. But switching over and in to actually limbing out wood that's both standing and wood that you've cut down, the Excalibur is a bit more flexible, and it has to do with the blade shape. Now, a lot of people don't like a blade shape like this. They find it a bit too restrictive, and they say, well, you can really only do power cutting in this area, and that's true. If you try to do power cutting down here on thick wood, you'll find that you simply won't get the full depth of penetration because, of course, you got that curve. So you'll get deep penetration here, but where the blade curves up out of the way, the depth of cut is behind, so your chips won't release. You have to cut up here. But you have essentially three distinct regions. Right here, which is for your main thick chopping, right here, which is your trapping section, and right there, which is your sweep through section. And they're used for very different things. When I'm cutting softer green wood, I want to trap it because I know I can cut through it. I don't want the wood to slip out of the way, so I want to trap it in here and completely cut it. When I'm cutting harder wood and springier wood, I don't want to trap it. If I don't make the cut all the way through, I don't want the blade to bind up in the wood. For a couple of reasons. Number one, the blade will chatter back and forth like that, which is not very good for the blade or the edge. But more importantly, as the blade is chattering, so is my wrist and hand. I don't want that for long-term fatigue. So on harder and springier wood, which mightn't be kind of obvious, I'll cut with it up here because, again, if I can't make the cut, I want the blade to slide out. That's much freer. It's smoother on the blade, smoother on me. So I get a partial cut, okay, fine, now I go back, do another cut, and maybe another one to finish it. Again, I don't have that trap where the blade brings up and then sort of haul the blade out and do it. I have a free, smooth, very smooth number of cuts. So again, three distinct regions on a blade like this. If you use them properly, you can appreciate the functionality. If you try to use them for where the opposite effect, if you try, for example, to cut that harder, springier wood down here, you can end up with that jarring sort of effect. If you try to cut your softer wood up here, you can often get the blade to sweep out of the wood. It won't make the cut completely. So again, you have to know how to bring each aspect of this blade into the performance on the wood, and then you'll really appreciate it. But you have to do that. When you have a blade that's sort of more neutral in design like this, it's sort of Golok shaped, where the entire blade is sort of one large, very slight continuous belly, it doesn't matter where you cut with it, you get the same sort of pull-through action with all of the blade. So what I found was that if I wanted to fell the wood, cut it down close to the ground, I wanted to use this. When I wanted to limit out, I wanted to use the Excalibur. So what I would actually do, of course, because you're not going to go up to the woods and carry a half dozen large knives with you, is I'd actually take the broadleaf up and I'd do all the felling that I wanted to do on one particular day, just knock all the wood down. And then the next time that I wanted to go up, I'd take the Excalibur up and I'd use that to limit out and clear it all off, and the extra length and reach that it had, I'd cut down the lighter vegetation and get it out of the way. So again, it's not a which blade is better type deal, it's what each of them do better, and then doing that with a particular blade to sort of maximize the performance. Now, in regards to splitting, I didn't do very much splitting with either one of these blades, and I'm not likely to. While it may look like they'd be good splitters because they're relatively thick, and especially this one has a narrow profile, they have very thin edge geometries on them. This one has no secondary edge bevel at all. It has around a 6.5 degree primary bevel, and it tapers in the very last, say, 30 thousandths to only around 12 degrees per side. So this is actually of an almost similar angle to a Mora, right down at the very edge, but then thins out behind it much better. So it has much higher cutting ability than a standard Mora. The wood that I split around here is very knotty, twisty grain wood. A lot of it's reclaimed, so it's gone through multiple cycles of drying out, getting wet, drying out, and getting wet. So it's not very easy to split. And I'd have to sort of chisel cut it through knots and twisted grain, and I'd want edges a bit heavier than this. I'd want them in a minimum 25 to 30 thou thick to take that kind of really heavy use. And that's an edge that I only need for splitting wood. I don't need that for cutting wood. And if I ran them that thick so that I could split the type of wood I had to split around here, I'd notice a bit lower performance. So what I do is basically, I'd only have a couple of knives that I would use for stuff like that, and that's what I would use to do splitting. Now, most production factory knives and even some custom knives come with edges on them that are initially that heavy. So oftentimes when I get a knife initially, I'll do some of that to try to have a look at it. But after I get the blade to where I want to do it, I usually thin the edge out and don't do that. Now, I'm not saying that you can't split wood with either one of these blades. You can easily split the type of wood that you see in most videos where someone puts a knife on a piece of wood, gives it a tap, and the wood falls apart. but I'm just saying for the twisted, knotty type wood that we have around here, I'd want edges around 25 to 35 thou, and both of these are much thinner than that. In regards to durability, edge holding, you can see in the pictures that a decent amount of wood was cut. It had no effect on either one of these blades significantly, to the point where they can easily still cut fine grasses, light vegetation, do very fine cuts on bark, and even cut papers. Again, if that seems surprising, wood is wood. It's very non-abrasive, unless you're working with some woods. Some types of woods are a little bit more abrasive. But most woods that people cut that are not sort of extreme are juniper, birch, oak, pine, maple, types of woods like that. You can just cut a ginormous amount of those woods, like literally thousands of pieces, and it does nothing to blades at all. The only section of this blade at all that was slightly damaged is up here, and by slightly damaged I mean I can slightly see it reflect light. And that's because if you look closely at some of the areas where I was cutting down close to the ground, I went through the tree and into the ground, so it dug into the dirt, and that's all that is. But I have 3 other knives made out of the same steel by Collier CKC knives. They sharpen up, are really easy. The grindability is very high, and which is one of the strengths of this. It's very easy to maintain. So is 01, by the way, which is in the Excalibur. Very easy to grind, and your simplest abrasive will work very well on it. This curve sort of flabbergasts some people. The only thing that I will say is that it can be easier to work keeping the blade fixed and working on it with a small stone, rather than trying to sort of finagle this over a large bench stone, or try to work it on a Spyderco sharp maker or something, because it's so big and it's so awkward trying to maintain your angle, because you want to keep the edge perpendicular to the stone to keep your angle consistent. So that's it overall. Like I said, 2 very interesting blades, 2 high performance blades, which has sort of positives and negatives over that sort of scope of work. I'm going to be using, as I said, different blades, sort of swapping them in to sort of make this a sort of rotating, fun sort of comparison series of videos. What I will say in advance is that some of the blades that I'm going to be using are not typical blades that you would see used for this type of work. Some of them even have a bit of a fantasy sort of fun design to their aspect. Some of them are going to be quite difficult to try to do this type of work with because of aspects of the design. And again, this series of videos is not strictly about evaluating the blades as a review type format. Again, it's just to mainly explore the differences in designs, differences in steels, handles, blade constructions, and just see what comes out of it in a sort of fun and enjoyable type manner. And some of the blades are, you know, relatively basic machete type patterns, nothing really surprising, but it will be interesting to see them. But some of them are very non-traditional, some of them are extreme, and it's going to be fun to actually use them. So looking forward to just doing the work, and it should be an interesting series of videos.